Vampire literature. Vampire literature covers the spectrum of literary work concerned principally with the subject of vampires. The literary vampire first appeared in 18th century poetry, before becoming one of the stock figures of Gothic fiction with the publication of Polidori's The Vampire 1819, which was inspired by the life and legend of Lord Byron. Later influential works include the penny dreadful Varney the Vampire 1847, Sheridan Le Fanu's Tale of a Lesbian Vampire, Carmilla 1872, and the most well-known, Bram Stoker's Dracula 1897. Some authors created a more sympathetic vampire, with Varney being the first, and Anne Rice's 1976 novel Interview with the Vampire as a more recent example. History. 18th century. Vampire fiction is rooted in the vampire craze of the 1720s and 1730s, which culminated in the somewhat bizarre official exhumations of suspected vampires Petr Blagojevich and Arnold Pale in Serbia under the Habsburg monarchy. One of the first works of art to touch upon the subject is the short German poem The Vampire 1748 by Heinrich August Ossenfelder, where the theme already has strong erotic overtones. A man whose love is rejected by a respectable and pious maiden threatens to pay her a nightly visit, drink her blood by giving her the seductive kiss of the vampire, and thus. Furthermore, there have been a number of tales about a dead person returning from the grave to visit his/her beloved or spouse and bring them death in one way or another. The narrative poem Lenore 1773 by Gottfried August Berger being a notable 18th century example, though the apparently returned lover is actually revealed to be Death himself in one of its lines, Den die Toten reiten schnell for the dead ride fast, was to be quoted in Bram Stoker's classic Dracula. A later German poem exploring the same subject with a prominent vampiric element was The Bride of Corinth 1797 by Goethe, a story about a young woman who returns from the grave to seek her betrothed. The story is turned into an expression of the conflict between heathendom and Christianity. The family of the dead girl are Christians, while the young man and his relatives are still pagans. It turns out that it was the girl's Christian mother who broke off her engagement and forced her to become a nun, eventually driving her to her death. The motive behind the girl's return as a spectre is that an earth can never cool down love. Goethe had been inspired by the story of Philemon by Phlegon of Tralles, a tale from classical Greece. However, in that tale, the youth is not the girl's betrothed, no religious conflict is present, no actual sucking of blood occurs, and the girl's return from the dead is said to be sanctioned by the gods of the underworld. She relapses into death upon being exposed, and the issue is settled by burning her body outside the city walls and making an apotropaic sacrifice to the deities involved. 19th century. The first mention of vampires in English literature appears in Robert Southey's monumental Oriental epic poem Thalaba. It has been argued that Samuel Taylor Coleridge's poem Christabel, written between 1797 and 1801, but not published until 1816, has influenced the development of vampire fiction. The heroine Christabel is seduced by a female supernatural being called Geraldine, who tricks her way into her residence. Though Coleridge never finished the poem, some argue that his intended plot had Geraldine eventually trying to marry Christabel after having assumed the appearance of Christabel's absent lover. The story bears a remarkable resemblance to the overtly vampiric story of Carmilla by Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu 1872. In a passage in his epic poem The Gyre 1813, Lord Byron alludes to the traditional folkloric conception of the vampire as a being damned to suck the blood and destroy the life of its nearest relations. But first on earth as vampire sent, thy corpse shall from its tomb be rent, then ghostly haunt thy native place, and suck the blood of all thy race. There from thy daughter, sister, wife at midnight drain the stream of life, yet loathe the banquet which perforce must feed thy livid living corpse. Thy victims ere they yet expire shall know thy demon for their sire, as cursing thee, thou cursing them, Thy flowers are withered on the stem. Byron also composed an enigmatic fragmentary story, published as a fragment in 1819 as part of the Macebeth collection, concerning the mysterious fate of an aristocrat named Augustus Darvel whilst journeying in the Orient, as his contribution to the famous ghost story competition at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva in the summer of 1806. This story provided the basis for the Vampyre 1819 by Polidori. Byron's own wild life became the model for Polidori's undead protagonist Lord Ruthven. According to A.S. John, the choice of name for Polidori's Lord Ruthven is presumably linked to Lady Caroline Lamb's earlier novel Glenarvan, where it was used for a rather ill-disguised Byronesque character. An unauthorized sequel to Polidori's tale by Cyprien Bérard, called Lord Ruthven ou les Vampires 1820, was attributed to Charles Nodier. Nodier himself adapted the Vampyre into the first vampire stage melodrama, Le Vampire. Unlike Polidori's original story, Nodier's play was set in Scotland. This, in turn, was adapted by the English melodramatist James Planch as The Vampyre, or The Bride of the Isles 1820 at the Lyceum, then called the English Opera House, also set in Scotland. Planch introduced the vampire trap as a way for the title fiend to appear in a dream at the beginning and then to vanish into the earth at his destruction. Nodier's play was also the basis of an opera called Der Vampum by the German composer Heinrich Marschner, who set the story in a more plausible Wallachia. Planch in turn translated the libretto of this opera into English in 1827, where it was performed at the Lyceum also. Alexander Dumas Peer later re-dramatized the story in a play also entitled Le Vampire 1851. Another theatrical vampire of this period was Sir Alan Raby, who is the lead character of The Vampire 1852, a play by Dion Boucicault. Boucicault himself played the lead role to great effect, though the play itself had mixed reviews. Queen Victoria, who saw the play, described it in her diary as very trashy. An important later example of 19th-century vampire fiction is the penny dreadful epic Varney the Vampire 1847, featuring Sir Francis Varney as the vampire. In this story, we have the first example of the standard trope in which the vampire comes through the window at night and attacks a maiden as she lies sleeping. Heathcliff in Emily Brant's Wuthering Heights 1847 is suspected of being a vampire by his housekeeper at one point, which he immediately laughs off as absurd nonsense. Fascinating erotic fixations are evident in Sheridan Le Fanu's classic novella Carmilla 1872, which features a female vampire with lesbian inclinations who seduces the heroine Laura while draining her of her vital fluids. Le Fanu's story is set in the Duchy of Styria. Such Central European locations became a standard feature of vampire fiction. Another important example of the development of vampire fiction can be found in three seminal novels by Paul Feble: Le Chevalier Ténébreux 1860, Le Vampire 1865, and La Ville Vampire 1874. Marie Nizit's Le Capitaine Vampire 1879 features a Russian officer, Boris Lyatowkin, who is a vampire. In German literature, one of the most popular novels was Hans Wachenhausen's Der Vampa novel, Aus Bulgarien 1878, which, on account of the author's first-hand experience of Ottoman society, includes a detailed description of the multicultural society of Bulgaria, and which contains an atmosphere that is in some parts comparable to Dracula. The most famous Serbian vampire was Sava Savanovic from a folklore-inspired novel 90 years later by Milovan Glizic, first published in 1880. Serbian vampires, depicted first in French 1839 and then Russian 1884, also appear in Count Tolstoy's novella The Family of the Verdelak. Dracula. Bram Stoker's Dracula 1897 has been the definitive description of the vampire in popular fiction for the last century. Its portrayal of vampirism as a disease-contagious demonic possession, with its undertones of sex, blood, and death, struck a chord in a Victorian Britain where tuberculosis and syphilis were common. Although it has been claimed that the character of Count Dracula is based upon Vlad Dracula Roman III Vlad the Impaler, also known as Vlad Tepes, a notorious 15th-century Wallachian Romanian warlord or voivode, this has been debunked by multiple scholars. Unlike the historical personage, however, Stoker located his Count Dracula in a castle near the Borgo Pass in Transylvania and ascribed to that area the supernatural aura it retains to this day in the popular imagination. Stoker likely drew inspiration from Irish myths of blood-sucking creatures. He was also influenced by Le Fanu's Carmilla. Le Fanu was Stoker's editor when Stoker was a theatre critic in Dublin, Ireland. Like Le Fanu, Stoker created compelling female vampire characters, such as Lucy Westenra and the Brides of Dracula. Stoker's vampire hunter Abraham Van Helsing was a strong influence on subsequent vampire literature. 20th century. Though Stoker's Count Dracula remained an iconic figure, especially in the new medium of cinema, as in the film Nosferatu, 20th-century vampire fiction went beyond traditional Gothic horror and explored new genres such as science fiction. An early example of this is Gustave Le Rouge Le Prisonnier de la Planète Mars 1908 and its sequel La Guerre des Vampires 1909, in which a native race of bat-winged, blood-drinking humanoids is found on Mars. In the 1920 novel Le Jeune Vampire, The Young Vampire by J. Vampire by J. H. Rossi Ain, vampirism is explained as a form of possession by souls originating. Possibly the most influential example of modern vampire science fiction is Richard Matheson's I Am Legend 1954. The novel is set in a future Los Angeles overrun with undead cannibalistic/bloodsucking beings. The protagonist is the sole survivor of a pandemic of a bacterium that causes vampirism. He must fight to survive attacks from the hordes of nocturnal creatures, discover the secrets of their biology, and develop effective countermeasures. The novel was adapted into 3 movies: The Last Man on Earth starring Vincent Price in 1964, The Omega Man starring Charlton Heston in 1971, and I Am Legend film starring Will Smith in 2007. The latter part of the 20th century saw the rise of multi-volume vampire epics. The first of these was Gothic romance writer Marilyn Rossi's Barnabas Collins series 1966-71, loosely based on the contemporary American TV soap opera Dark Shadows. It also set the trend for seeing vampires as poetic, tragic heroes rather than as the traditional embodiment of evil. This formula was followed in the popular Vampire Chronicles 1976 series of novels by Anne Rice and Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's massive Saint Germain series 1978. Ross, Rice, and Yarbrough set the trend for multi-volume vampire sagas, which are now a stock feature of mass-market fiction. See below for list. Rice's work also saw the beginning of the convergence of traditional Gothic ideas with the modern Gothic subculture and a more explicit exploration of the transgressive sexualities which had always been implicit in Vampyre. The 1981 novel The Hunger, adapted as a film in 1983, continued the theme of open sexuality and examined the biology of vampires, suggesting that their special abilities were the result of physical properties of their blood. The novel suggested that not all vampires were undead humans, but some were a separate species that had evolved alongside humans. This interpretation of vampires has since then been used in several science fiction stories dealing with vampires, most famously the Blade movie series. The 1982 novel Fever Dream by notable author George R.R. Martin tells the tale of a race of living vampires, extremely human-like but obligate predators on humans, set in the Mississippi Riverboat era, where one of them has developed a dietary supplement to cure them, and is fighting for the right and opportunity to distribute it. Kim Newman's Anno Dracula series 1992 returns to Stoker's Count Dracula, looking at an alternate world where Dracula defeated Van Helsing's group and conquered Britain, and gives the genre a somewhat postmodern spin. The television series Buffy, the Vampire Slayer, created and largely written by Joss Whedon, also explored vampire folklore in the light of postmodern and feminist theory, defining the condition as humans who were made to drink vampire blood after the vampire drinks from them, with turned vampires being essentially demons possessing human corpses. Post-colonial perspectives on the vampire legend are provided in Nalo Hopkinson's novel Brown Girl in the Ring 1998, which features the Saucouant, a vampire of Caribbean folklore, and in Tananarive Dew's My Soul to Keep 1995. One of the more traditional vampire works of the 20th century is Stephen King's Salem's Lot 1975, which reimagines the archetypal Dracula-type story in a modern American small-town setting. King acknowledged the influence of Dracula on the work, as well as the violent, pre-comics code vampires portrayed in horror comics such as those released by EC Comics. In 1989, a comprehensive bibliography of vampire literature was published. Margaret L. Carter's The Vampire in Literature, a critical bibliography, Ann Arbor, Michigan, USA, Yumi Research Press. 21st century traits of vampires in fiction. The traits of the literary vampire have evolved from the often repulsive figures of folklore. Fictional vampires can be romantic figures, often described as elegant and sexy compared demons such as succubi and incubi. This is in stark contrast to the vampire of Eastern European folklore, which was a horrifying animated corpse. However, as in folklore, the literary vampire is sustained by drinking blood. They do not need other food, water, or even oxygen. They are sometimes portrayed as being unable to eat human food at all, forcing them to either avoid public dining or mime chewing and eating to deceive their mortal victims. The fictional vampire, however, often has a pale appearance rather than the dark or ruddy skin of folkloric vampires, and their skin is cool to the touch. As in folklore, literary vampires can usually be warded off with garlic and symbols of the Christian faith, such as holy water, a crucifix, or a rosary. According to literary scholar Nina Arbach in Our Vampires, Ourselves, the influence of the moon was seen as dominant in the earliest examples of vampire literature. For at least 50 years after Planche's Vampyre, the moon was the central ingredient of vampire iconography. Vampires' solitary and repetitive lives consisted of incessant deaths, and when the moon shone down on them, quivering rebirths. Ruthven, Varney, and Raby need marriage and blood to replenish their vitality, but they turn for renewed life to the moon. A corpse quivering to life under the moon's rays is the central image of mid-century vampire literature. Fangs, penetration, sucking, and staking are all peripheral to its lunar obsession. Bram Stoker's Dracula was hugely influential in its depiction of vampire traits, some of which are described by the novel's vampire expert Abraham Van Helsing. Dracula has the ability to change his shape at will, his featured forms in the novel being that of a wolf, bat, mist, and fog. He can also crawl up and down the vertical external walls of his castle in the manner of a lizard. One very famous trait that Stoker added is the inability to be seen in mirrors, which is not found in traditional Eastern European folklore, as Stoker combined the folklore of Jiangxi being terrified of their own reflection with the material fact of the silver-backed mirrors of the time. Dracula also had protruding teeth, though was preceded in this by Varney the Vampire and Carmilla. In Anne Rice's books, the vampires appear their best self of the age they were turned into a vampire. For instance, when Claudia was turned into a vampire, her golden curls became tight and voluminous, her skin turns a pale but smooth and clear, and rids her of the rotting disease. But it also seems like a curse, as she retains her child body for her entire vampire lifetime, and any modifications on her body, such as even cutting her hair, grows it back to the same length as it was before. A similar occurrence can be observed in the Twilight series when Bella is turned into a vampire, her wounds heal, hair becomes healthy and shiny, her broken back and ribs get mended. The color comes back to her skin, and her sunken eyes, cheeks, and skinny body return to a healthy state. In fact, she is brought back to life from the brink of death by turning her into a. In the Dracula novel, the vampire hunter Van Helsing prescribes that a vampire be destroyed by a wooden stake preferably made of white oak through the heart, decapitation, drowning, or incineration. The vampire's head must be removed from its body, the mouth stuffed with garlic and holy water or relics, the body drawn and quartered, then burned and spread into the four winds, with the head buried on hallowed ground. The destruction of the vampire Lucy follows the three-part process enjoined by Van Helsing: staking, decapitation, and garlic in the mouth. Traditional vampire folklore, followed by Stoker in Dracula, does not usually hold that sunlight is fatal to vampires, though they are nocturnal. It is also notable in the novel that Dracula can walk about in the daylight in bright sunshine, though apparently in discomfort, and without the ability to use most of his powers, like turning into mist or a bat. He is still strong and fast enough to struggle with and escape from most of his male pursuers. Fatal exposure to sunlight of a vampire in their coffin dates at least as far back as the story of Yand Manor House 1898 by E. and H. Heron. Such scenes in vampire films, however, most especially 1922's Nosferatu and the closing scene of the 1958 film Dracula, in which Count Dracula is, for instance, Anne Rice's vampire Lestat and Chelsea Quinn Yarborough's Count St. Germain both avoid the lethal effects of daylight by staying closeted indoors during the day. A well-known set of special powers and weaknesses is commonly associated with vampires in contemporary fiction. There is a tendency, however, for authors to pick and choose the ones they like, or find more realistic ones, and have their characters ridicule the rest as absurd. For example, in the movie Blade, the vampire hunter Blade tells Karen Jensen what kills vampires: stakes, silver, and sunlight, and dismisses tactics seen in vampire movies, namely crosses and running water, as ineffective. Some vampires can fly. This power may be supernatural levitation, or it may be connected to the vampire's shape-shifting ability. Some traditions hold that a vampire cannot enter a house unless he or she is invited in. Generally, a vampire needs be invited in only once, and then can come and go at will. Stephen King's novel Salem's Lot explored an unusual direction with this myth in having one of the protagonists revoke a vampire's invitation to a house. The vampire was forced to flee the building immediately. This is also featured in the American TV series True Blood, where Sookie withdraws her invitation on a number of occasions, causing vampires to be thrown out by supernatural forces. Also in the Vampire Diaries, when a newly turned vampire wakes up in a house that he was not invited into, he immediately flees. Some tales maintain that vampires must return to a coffin or to their native soil before sunrise to take their rest safely. Others place native soil in their coffins, especially if they have relocated. Still other vampire stories, such as Le Fanu's Carmilla, maintain that vampires must return to their coffins, but sleep in several inches of blood as opposed to soil. Vampires are generally held to be unable to bear children, though the concept of a half-vampire and similar creatures does exist in folklore and in some modern fiction. Some fictional vampires are fascinated with counting, an idea derived from folk stories about vampires being compelled to stop and count any spilled grain. The most famous fictional counting vampire is likely the Muppet character Count Von Count on television's Sesame Street. Other examples include a fifth-season episode of The X-Files titled Bad Blood, and the Discworld novel Carp Jugulum by Terry Pratchett. Some modern fictional vampires are portrayed as having magical powers beyond those originally assigned by myth, typically also possessing the powers of a witch or seer. Such examples include Drusilla from Buffy the Vampire Slayer. Drusilla was a seer before she was a vampire, and carried those powers into her undeath, and Olivia Nightshade from the Nightshade Chronicles. Also vampires from the Vampire Academy books, also known as the Moroi, are skilled in elemental magic. Also, in the Twilight series, Certain vampires appear to have special gifts, like Edward telepathy, Alice visions, Bella shielding, that are either supernatural or evolved from their own personalities, like Victoria survival instinct. Vampire hybrids. The Vampyre, the offspring of a vampire and a human known from Serbian folklore, has been popularized in recent fiction. Literature. Poems. Der Vampyre the Vampire by Heinrich August Ossenfelder 1748. Lenore by Gottfried August Berger 1773. Travels into Dalmatia by Alberto Fortis 1774, including a story of fighting against vampires. Braut von Corinth, The Bride of Corinth by Johann Wolfgang von Goethe 1797. Thalaba the Destroyer by Robert Southey 1801. The Vampire by John Stagg 1810. The Gyre by Lord Byron 1813. Christabel by Samuel Taylor Coleridge 1816. Verdelak by Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin 1836. Prose. Fragment of a novel, Unfinished Vampire, story by Lord Byron 1819. The Vampire by John William Polidori 1819. The Black Vampire by Uriah Darcy 1819. Lord Ruthven, Les Vampires by Cyprien Bérard 1820, often attributed to Charles Nodier, who, as a matter of fact, only made the theatre play version of it. Vampirismus by E.T.A. Hoffmann 1821. Wake Not the Dead by Ernst Roppach 1823, often misattributed to Johann Ludwig Tieck. The Virgin Vampire by Étienne Léon de Lamothe Langon 1825. La Mort Amoureuse, The Dead Woman in Love by Théophile Gautier 1836. The Family of the Verdelak by Count Alexis Tolstoy 1843. Varney the Vampire, or The Feast of Blood by James Malcolm Rymer or Thomas Peckett Prest 1847. Vampire by Vladimir Dal 1848. The Pale Lady by Alexander Dumas 1849. The Mysterious Stranger by Anonymous, translated from the original German. This vampire tale appeared in the English magazine Odds and Ends in 1860. Le Chevalier Ténèbres Nightshade by Paul Féval 1860. La Vampire, The Vampire Countess by Paul Féval 1865. La Femme Immortelle, The Immortal Woman by Pierre Alexis de Ponson du Terrail 1869. Il Vampiro. Storia Vera the Vampire, True Story by Franco Mistrali 1869. Carmilla 1872 by Sheridan Le Fanu. La Ville Vampire, Vampire City by Paul Féval 1874. Le Capitaine Vampire, Captain Vampire by Marie Nizet 1879. After 90 Years by My Love and Glizik 1880. The Fate of Madame Cabanel by Eliza Lynn Linton 1880. Manor by Karl Heinrich Ulrich 1884. The True Story of the Vampire by Count Stanislaus Erich Stenbach 1894. Lilith by George MacDonald 1895. Dracula by Bram Stoker 1897. The Blood of the Vampire by Florence Marryat 1897. The Tomb of Sarah by F. G. Loring 1900. The House of the Vampire by George Sylvester Viereck 1907. Vampiro by Enrico Boni 1908. The Lair of the White Worm by Bram Stoker 1911. For the Blood is the Life by F. Marion Crawford 1911. Vampyre the Vampire by W. Ladislaw Raymond 1911. The Room in the Tower by E. F. Benson 1912. Dracula's Guest by Bram Stoker 1914. The Vampire by Jan Neruda 1920, posthumous. Mrs. Amworth by E. F. Benson 1922. Bewitched by Edith Wharton 1927. The Hills of the Dead by Robert E. Howard 1930. The Dark Castle by Marion Brandon 1931. Revelations in Black by Carl Jacobi 1933. Vampires Overhead by Alan Hyder 1935. Doom of the House of Duria by Earl Pearce Jr. 1936. Lady Christina by Mercy Iliade 1936. The Man Upstairs by Ray Bradbury 1943. The Girl with the Hungry Eyes by Fritz Leiber 1949. I Am Legend by Richard Matheson, 1954. The Longest Night by Ray Russell, 1960. Vampyre's Moon by Peter Saxon, 1970. The Night Stalker by Jeffrey Grant Rice, 1973. Pages from a Young Girl's Journal by Robert Aikman, 1973. Salem's Lot by Stephen King, 1975. One for the Road by Stephen King, 1977. A sequel to Salem's Lot. The Night Flyer by Stephen King, 1988. Popsy by Stephen King, 1993. The Little Sisters of Illyria by Stephen King, 1998. The Dark Tower v. Wolves of the Calla by Stephen King, 2003. The Dark Tower Roman 7. The Dark Tower by Stephen King, 2004. Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice, 1976. The Silmarillion by J.R.R. Tolkien, 1977. The Hunger by Whitley Strieber, 1981. The Keep by F. Paul Wilson, 1981. They Thirst by Robert McCammon, 1981. The Journal of Edwin Underhill by Peter Tonkin, 1981. Fever Dream by George R. R. Martin, 1982. The Delicate Dependency by Michael Talbot, 1982. The Dragon Waiting by John M. Ford, 1983. The Light at the End by John Skipp and Craig Spector, 1986. Those Who Hunt the Night UK title, Immortal Blood by Barbara Hambly, 1988. The Stress of Her Regard by Tim Powers, 1989. Vampire Dollar by John Stakely, 1990. The Silver Kiss by Annette Curtis Claus, 1991. Vampire of the Mists by Christy Golden, 1991. Night of the Black Rose by James Loder, 1991. Lost Souls by Poppy Z. Bright, 1992. The books I. Strahd, Memories of the Vampire, 1993, and I. Strahd, The War with Azalin by P.N. Elrod tells the tale of the vampire Lord Strahd von Zarovich, who occupies the castle Raveloft. Traveling with the Dead by Barbara Hambly, 1995. A sequel to Immortal Blood. Dracula the Undead by Frida Warrington, 1997, commissioned by Penguin Books as a sequel to Bram Stoker's Dracula for the centenary of the latter's first publication. Carp Jugulum by Terry Pratchett, 1998. Sunshine by Robin McKinley, 2003. Let the Right One in Lat den Rat, in the original Swedish by John Ajvide Lindqvist, 2004. Translated into English in 2007. The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova, 2005. Fledgling by Octavia Butler, 2005. Renfield, Slave of Dracula by Barbara Hambly, 2006. Morrigan's Cross, Dance of the Gods and Valley of Silence, The Circle Trilogy by Nora Roberts, 2006. Empire v. The original Russian title Empire v is an acronym of the word vampire by Victor Pelevin, 2006. Fangland by John Marks, 2007. Blood Oath by Christopher Farnsworth, 2010. Modern Marvels Victoriana by Wayne Reinagel, 2011. Batman Apollo original Russian title Batman Apollo by Victor Pelevin, 2013. No S4 at Woe by Joe Hill, 2013. Dr. Sleep by Stephen King, 2013. A sequel to King's novel, The Shining, 1977. With the People from the Bridge by Dimitris Lyakos, 2014. The Vampire of Gotham by Lev Raphael, 2014. The New Romantics, 10 Stories of Mystery, Passion, Travel and Vampires, Bangkok Underground and Baltimore's Vampire Culture are the two vampires stories here by Richard Marinka. Captive by Gabrielle Esters. Vlad, The Last Confession by Chris Humphreys. The Orange Sponge and Storytelling at the Vamp Art Cafe by Saint Suki Delacqua, 2020. Fiction series. There are several recent series in vampire fiction of variable literary quality. They tend to either take the form of direct sequels or prequels to the first book published or detail the ongoing adventures of particular characters. Cassandra Clare, The Mortal Instruments series, 2007 to 2014, excluding spin-off books. Laura Adrian's Midnight Breed series, 2007. Elaine Bergstrom's Austria Vampires series 1989. Jenna Black's Guardians of the Night series 2006. Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files series 2000. Not all of these novels concern themselves largely with vampires, but a war between vampires and wizards figures heavily in the story. PC Cast and Kristen Cast's House of Night series is 8 series. Cressley Cole's The Immortals After Dark series 2006. Nancy A. Collins's Sonia Blue series 1989. Les Daniels' Don Sebastian Vampire Chronicles series. Mary Janice Davidson's Undead series 2004. Guillermo del Toro with Chuck Hogan's The Strain 2009, The Fall 2010, and The Night Eternal 2011. La Trilogia de la Oscuridad. P.N. Elrod's Vampire Files series 1990. P.N. Elrod's Jonathan Barrett Gentleman Vampire series. Christine Feehan's Dark series 1999. Jean Frost's Night Huntress series 2007. Christopher Golden's Shadow Saga 1994-2014. Laurel K. Hamilton's Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series 1993. Charlene Harris's The Southern Vampire Mysteries 2001. Kim Harrison's Hollows series 2004. Tanya Huff's Blood Books series 1991-1997. Faith Hunter's Jane Yellow Rock series 2009. Charlie Huston's Joe Pitt Case Files series 2005. Jasper Kent's Danilov Quintet 2009. Justin Cronin's The Passage 2010, The 12 2012, and City of Mirrors 2016. Sherilyn Kenyon's Dark Hunter 2002. E. Knight's Vampire Earth series 2003. Brian Lumley's Necroscope series 1986. Richelle Mead's Vampire Academy and Bloodlines series. Stephanie Meyer's Twilight series 2005-2008. Deborah Harkness's A Discovery of Witches 2011-2018. Christopher Moore's A Love Story series 1995-2007. Kim Newman's Anno Dracula series 1992. Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles series 1976. Marilyn Ross's Barnabas Collins series 1966-1971. Fred Saberhagen's Vlad Tepes series 1975-2002. Darren Shan's The Saga of Darren Shan series 2000-2006. Maggie Shane's Wings in the Night series 1993. L.J. Smith's The Vampire Diaries series. Gene C. Stein's Anna Strong series. Whitley Strieber's The Hunger series 1981-2002. J.R. Ward's Black Dagger Brotherhood series 2011. Frida Warrington's Bloodwine series 1992. David Wellington's 13 Bullets, 99 Coffins, Vampire Zero, 23 Hours. Laura Caxton, James R. Kelly series. Gene Wolfe's Earth, Book of the Short Sun Trilogy 1999-2001. Chelsea Quinn Yarbrough's St. Germain series 1978. Chloe Neal's Chicagoland Vampires series. White Wolf, a maker of role-playing games, releases novels set in the fantasy world of its vampire, The Masquerade Game. These series of novels were released in 13 book sets, each corresponding to one of the 13 clans of vampires in their game universe. Juvenile fiction. The Mortal Instruments series by Cassandra Clare 2007-2014 excluding spin-off books. The Little Vampire series by Angela Sommer Bodenberg 1979. The Bunnicula series by Deborah Howe and James Howe 1979. The School for Vampires series by Jackie Neebish 1985. The Dark Angel series by Meredith and Pierce 1982-1990. The Vampire Diaries series by L.J. Smith author 1991. The Night World series by L.J. Smith 1996. The Silver Kiss by Annette Curtis Claus 1992. The Last Vampire series by Christopher Pike 1994. Companions of the Night 1995 by Vivian Van Velde. How to Be a Vampire 1996 by R. L. Stein. A Vampire in the Neighborhood Short Story and Tales to Give You Goosebumps by R.L. Stine 1994. Vampire Breath Book #49 in the Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine 1996. Please Don't Feed the Vampire, Book #15 in the Give Yourself Goosebumps series by R.L. Stine 1997. The Chronicles of Vladimir Todd series by Z. Brewer 2007. Who's Your Mummy? Book #6 in the Goosebumps Horrorland series by R.L. Stine 2009. Welcome to Horrorland, a survival guide. Book #13 in the Goosebumps Horrorland series by R.L. Stine 2009. Goosebumps Monster Survival Guide 2015. Vampire Express 1984, Book #31 in Choose Your Own Adventure. Fighting for Blood 1996, Book #7 in Choose Your Own Nightmare. Amelia Atwater Rhodes's Novels in the Forests of the Night 1999, Demon in My View 2000, Shattered Mirror 2001, Midnight Predator 2002, and Persistence of Memory 2008. The Saga of Darren Shan, also known as the Cirque du Freak series 2004 by Darren Shan. Sweet Blood by P. Hawkman 2003. The Vampire Kisses series by Ellen Schreiber 2005. Peeps by Scott Westerfeld 2005. The Twilight series by Stephanie Meyer 2005-2008. The Last Days by Scott Westerfeld 2006. The Blue Bloods series by Melissa de la Cruz 2006. The Vampire Academy series by Richelle Mead 2006-2010. Tantalize by Cynthia Latich Smith 2007. The House of Night series by PC Cast and Kristen Cast 2007. The Reformed Vampire Support Group by Catherine Jinks 2009. Jessica's Guide to Dating on the Dark Side by Beth Fantasky 2009. The Little Dracula series by Martin Waddell and Joseph Wright 1986-2001. The Coldest Girl in Coal Town by Holly Black 2013. Carry On by Rainbow Rowell 2015. Vampire fiction based on TV series. Angel, C. List of Angel novels. Being Human, C. Being Human novels. Buffy the Vampire Slayer, C. List of Buffy the Vampire Slayer novels. Carmilla, C. Carmilla novelization. Doctor Who, C. Blood Harvest. Goth Opera. World Game. The Eight Doctors. Vampire Science. The Vampire Curse. Short Trips Defining Patterns. Twilight's End. Dark Shadows. See Dark Shadows novels. Novels #6-32. Forever Night. See Forever Night novels. I Heart Vampires. See I Heart Vampires. Birth: A Confessions of a High School Vampire Novel. The Originals. See The Originals novels. The Vampire Diaries. See Stephen's Diaries. Comic books. Comic books and graphic novels which feature vampires include Vampire La Warren Publishing, 1969, Morbius the Living Vampire Marvel, 1971, The Tomb of Dracula Marvel Comics, 1972, Blade Marvel, 1973, I, Vampire DC Comics, 1981, Proinsias Cassidy, the supporting lead male in Garth Ennis' comic book series Preacher DC/Vertigo 1995, is a vampire of Irish origin. In addition, many major superheroes have faced vampire supervillains at some point. In the Belgo-French comic La Balle du Rat Mort, Police Inspector Jean Lamorgue is a hybrid vampire, and he is a king of rats. He is guiding an invasion of rats in Ostend, and he sucks the blood of his human victims. In 2009, Zuda Comics launched La Mort Sisters, a story of teenage vampirism in a Catholic orphanage taking place in South Philadelphia. The story follows new girl Maddie in a world of ninja nuns and black magic. American Vampire, created by Scott Snyder, was published in 2010. It explores the idea of the evolution of vampires, leading to new species throughout American history. Magazines. Magazines which feature vampires include Bite Me magazine, launched 1999. Typical features include interviews with vampire actors, features on famous vampire film classics, vampire-related news, forthcoming vampire film and book releases. Defunct vampire magazines include Crimson England, Journal of the Dark US, Father Sebastian's Vampire Magazine US, and The Velvet Vampire, available to members of the disbanded The Vampire Society, England.